Lieutenant Lewis Curtis circled at 3,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, watching his wingman bob in a life raft below. Lieutenant Lacroix had taken a direct hit from Japanese anti-aircraft fire just minutes earlier, his P-51 Mustang shredded by flak over Bataan Island's airfield. Now Curtis was alone, protecting a downed pilot in enemy waters, waiting for rescue that wouldn't arrive until morning. February 10th, 1945. 2 enemy fighters destroyed in the air, 3 more blasted on the ground, and now Lacroix was floating 50 yards offshore from an island crawling with Japanese soldiers. Curtis checked his fuel gauge and grimaced. Maybe 20 minutes left, and the sun was already touching the western horizon. That's when he saw it. A twin-engine transport aircraft approaching from the east, landing gear down, flaps extended for final approach, flying straight toward Bataan Island's Japanese-controlled airfield like it owned the sky. Curtis pushed his throttle forward and climbed to intercept. The P-51 Bad Angel responded instantly as he closed the distance, his thumb hovering over the gun button that would unleash 6 50-caliber machine guns. As he drew closer, details resolved through the fading light. American star insignia, markings of the 39th Airlift Squadron, the Jungle Skippers. Curtis felt ice form in his stomach. This wasn't a Japanese copy with fake markings. This was an actual American transport plane about to land at a Japanese airfield. He keyed his radio and broadcast an urgent warning. The C-47 was approaching enemy territory and needed to wave off immediately. Static, no response. The C-47 continued its descent, now at 500 feet, committed to landing. Curtis knew exactly what the Japanese did to American prisoners. He'd spent months in an Italian POW camp after being shot down over Salerno in 1943, had escaped just before the Germans took control, had survived behind enemy lines long enough to understand what capture meant. If that C-47 landed, everyone aboard faced torture, interrogation, probable execution. The transport was at 300 feet now. Curtis had perhaps 60 seconds before it touched down on that runway. He rolled his P-51 and dove toward the C-47, making a decision that no other American pilot had ever made. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Pacific War. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard this story before. And if you appreciate this level of historical detail, please subscribe to the channel. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Lewis Curtis wasn't some rookie making panicked decisions. At 25, he was already a decorated ace with 7 German kills and 1 Italian fighter to his name from the Mediterranean theater. He'd flown P-38 Lightnings with the 82nd Fighter Group, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and learned the hard way what happened when things went wrong. August 1943, over Salerno, Italy. Curtis had broken formation to save a fellow pilot under attack by German fighters. He'd destroyed 2 Messerschmitts and saved the man's life, but took so much damage that both his engines quit. He crash-landed on a beach in enemy territory and was captured by Italian forces within hours. The POW camp near Rome taught him what capture meant. Interrogations, uncertainty, watching German forces try to take control after Italy surrendered. Curtis and 4 other Americans had stolen a boat attempting to escape, been recaptured, then finally broke free just before the Germans arrived. He'd spent months hiding in occupied territory before reaching Allied lines. Most shot-down pilots were sent home after that experience. Curtis volunteered to return to combat. The Geneva Conventions wouldn't let him fight in Europe again, so the Army sent him to the Pacific in August 1944, flying P-51 Mustangs with the 3rd Air Commando Group. 3 days before the incident over Bataan, Curtis had shot down a Japanese Ki-46 reconnaissance plane near Taiwan. That made him one of only 3 American pilots to destroy aircraft from all 3 Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was the kind of record that earned respect across the entire theater. But now, watching that C-47 descend toward a Japanese airfield, Curtis was about to add a fourth flag to his kill markings, one that no other American pilot would ever match. Curtis brought his Mustang alongside the C-47, close enough to see the pilots focused on their instruments, completely committed to landing. Neither looked at the P-51 flying 30 feet off their wing. He pulled ahead and waggled his wings, the universal signal to break off course. The transport maintained its heading. He dropped below their nose and pulled up sharply in front of them. Impossible to miss. The C-47 flew straight through the space where he'd been, still descending, now at 300 feet. The island's runway was less than a mile ahead, and Japanese anti-aircraft positions were tracking both aircraft. Curtis climbed 500 feet above and behind the transport, rolled inverted and dove, building speed. At 200 yards, he rolled upright and pulled into level flight directly behind the C-47. His thumb moved to the gun button. A 2-second burst would put roughly 150 caliber rounds into whatever he aimed at. But he wasn't trying to destroy the aircraft. He needed to disable it, force an ocean ditching instead of a runway landing. One chance to get it right, because if he missed or hit the fuselage, people would die. The C-47 was at 150 feet now, almost close enough to touch down. Curtis closed to 50 yards and aimed at the right engine nacelle, his thumb pressed down. The Mustang shuddered as all 6 guns fired. Tracers converged on the target. The right engine erupted in flames, black smoke pouring from the cowling as the propeller slowed and stopped. The pilot reacted instantly, banking left to compensate for lost power, advancing throttle on the good engine. But the C-47 was built tough, designed to fly on one engine. It adjusted course slightly but continued descending. Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Tracers arced up from positions around the airfield, 20mm shells exploding close enough to rock Curtis's Mustang. He ignored the flak and repositioned behind the transport, lining up on the left engine. The C-47 was at 100 feet now, perhaps 10 seconds from touchdown. He squeezed the trigger. His guns roared, tracers converging on the left engine. The effect was immediate. The engine disintegrated, pieces tumbling away in the slipstream. The propeller twisted, bent, stopped. The C-47 had no power now, no thrust, no options except the ocean ahead. The pilot fought the controls, trying to maintain altitude, setting up for emergency water landing. The transport's belly touched down, sending up huge plumes of spray. It skipped once, twice, then settled and began to slow. The fuselage remained intact. No explosion, no fireball. People scrambled out onto the wings. 8, 9, 10 shapes climbing into a life raft. All alive, all floating safely away from the sinking aircraft. And most importantly, floating in international waters instead of standing on a Japanese runway. Curtis dropped low and made a strafing pass along the shoreline, his guns tearing up the beach and sending soldiers diving for cover. He couldn't stop the Japanese permanently, but he could slow them down. The Croy's raft was still bobbing nearby. Now Curtis had 2 groups of Americans to protect, both in enemy waters, both at risk of capture. His fuel gauge showed critical levels, maybe 10 minutes before his engine quit. He radioed his wingman still circling above, calling in rescue for 2 life rafts and reporting 13 Americans in the water off Bataan Island with Japanese forces trying to reach them. Darkness fell fast. Curtis circled as long as his fuel allowed, making low passes whenever Japanese boats tried to approach the rafts. At 10 minutes of fuel remaining, he had no choice. He waggled his wings in salute to the people below and turned east, landing at Mangaldan Airfield with his gauge reading empty. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Curtis explained the tactical situation, justified his decision, provided coordinates, and requested a PBY Catalina for rescue at dawn. His squadron commander listened, then picked up the phone to call higher command. What Curtis didn't know was what had happened aboard that C-47. The transport had taken off from Leyte headed for Manila with 12 people total, including 2 Army nurses. Weather had pushed them off course. After 5 hours flying blind with a malfunctioning radio, the pilot had broken into clear sky and spotted an island with a runway. He'd assumed it was friendly territory. When the Mustang appeared, he thought it was escort. When it opened fire, the crew was horrified, certain they were under attack by a rogue pilot. Then both engines were burning, and the pilot had no choice except the ocean. They spent the night in the rafts, floating in shark-infested waters, watching Japanese searchlights sweep across the ocean. Lacroix had paddled over and explained the situation. They were off Baton Island, a Japanese base. That American pilot had saved their lives by preventing them from landing. The crew went from angry to grateful in 30 seconds. One of the nurses was a 19-year-old Russian-American woman named Svetlana Valeria. She stared at the burning wreckage and wondered what kind of pilot had the skill to shoot out both engines without killing anyone. At 0530 hours, Lewis Curtis took off leading 4 P-51s. A PBY Catalina followed, vulnerable but equipped to land on water. The sun was just breaking when they spotted the rafts, still floating safely away from shore. The PBY landed smoothly and began pulling people aboard. Curtis circled overhead, watching for Japanese aircraft. Within 20 minutes, all 13 Americans were safely on the flying boat. Lacroix radioed up that all souls were aboard and heading home, adding that the C-47 crew wanted to buy Curtis a drink. Curtis smiled inside his oxygen mask and told them he'd collect when they got back. The PBY lifted off and turned south. Just another mission, just another day in the Pacific War. Except Lewis Curtis had done something no other American pilot had ever done. Shot down an American aircraft and saved American lives in the process. And he had no idea what kind of reaction awaited him. Curtis landed 2 hours later expecting either a medal or a court-martial. His squadron commander was standing on the flight line with a clipboard. "Lieutenant, General Kenny wants a full debriefing, and there's something you need to know about that C-47. General George Kenny, commander of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, was waiting in the operations tent. He slid a piece of paper across the table. The passenger manifest from the C-47. Curtis scanned the names. 4 crew, 8 passengers, 2 Army nurses. His eyes stopped on one name. His stomach dropped. Svetlana Valeria, Army Nurse Corps, age 19. The woman he'd taken to dinner 2 nights ago. The Russian-American nurse he'd met at a dance in Lingayen. The one who'd been an aspiring Hollywood actress before the war. The one who'd laughed at his stories and made him promise they'd have dinner again next week. He'd shot her plane out of the sky. Kenny watched Curtis's face go pale and asked if he'd met Nurse Valeria. Curtis confirmed they'd had dinner 2 nights ago, and he was supposed to see her again next week. Kenny noted dryly that Curtis had definitely seen her again, just not quite the way either of them had planned. There was a long silence. Curtis stared at the manifest. He'd disabled both engines on an aircraft carrying a woman he'd been hoping to see again, forced her to ditch in the ocean, left her floating overnight in enemy waters. Curtis asked if she was all right, if everyone had survived. Kenny confirmed everyone was fine. All 13 made it back safely. The nurses were at the field hospital, uninjured but shaken, though grateful to be alive. Kenny leaned forward and asked the critical question. Did Curtis know Nurse Valeria was on that aircraft when he opened fire? Curtis answered firmly, absolutely not. He had no idea who was aboard. He just knew it was Americans about to land at a Japanese airfield. Kenny nodded slowly. That's what he'd thought, and that's what would go in his report to the Pentagon. Curtis had made a tactical decision based on available information, and that decision saved 13 American lives. The fact that one of them was someone he knew was just unfortunate timing. Then Kenny smiled. Curtis wasn't facing charges. He was facing a commendation. The general was recommending an oak leaf cluster to his distinguished flying cross. Curtis couldn't believe it. The general was going to credit him with shooting down an American aircraft. Kenny said damn right he was. Curtis had disabled that aircraft to prevent enemy capture, executed with precision that prevented casualties, and saved 13 Americans. That was textbook decision-making under pressure. The only unusual part was that the aircraft was one of theirs. The general stood and told Curtis he still had to face Nurse Valeria and explain why he'd shot her out of the sky. Good luck with that conversation. Dismissed. Curtis had no idea how to explain shooting down his date. He was a decorated ace with kills against 3 Axis powers, and he had absolutely no clue how to handle this conversation. The field hospital was 3 tents at the airfield's edge. A nurse at the entrance gave him a warning look. She confirmed he was Lieutenant Curtis, the one who shot down the transport. Svetlana was in the recovery tent. But fair warning, the survivors had been pretty angry when they first arrived. They'd calmed down since Lacroix explained things, but he should approach carefully. Svetlana was sitting on a cot, still wearing her salt-stained uniform, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She looked up when he entered. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Svetlana stood, walked across the tent, and slapped him hard across the face. "That's for shooting me down," she said quietly. Then she kissed him. "And that's for saving my life." Curtis stood there stunned, his cheeks still stinging. Svetlana stepped back, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She explained that Lacroix had told them what would have happened if they'd landed. The Japanese didn't treat prisoners well, and female prisoners faced especially brutal treatment. Curtis managed to say he didn't know she was aboard, had no idea, just saw an American transport heading for a Japanese airfield. Svetlana acknowledged that he'd made the only decision that made sense. She sat back down on the cot and admitted she'd spent all night in that raft thinking he was crazy, that he'd attacked them for no reason. Then Lacroix paddled over and explained where they were, what that airfield was. She realized Curtis had saved them. Curtis apologized for her aircraft. Svetlana said she was sorry he'd had to shoot it down, that it must have been impossible. She asked when he'd realized it was her. He explained he'd seen the manifest that morning when General Kenny showed him the passenger list. Svetlana actually smiled and asked how Kenny had reacted. Curtis said the general was recommending him for a medal and had told him good luck explaining this to her. "Smart man," Svetlana observed. Then she stood again, closer this time, and asked if they were still having dinner next week. Curtis said if she'd still have him, after, shooting her down. "Most romantic second date ever," she replied. The story spread through the Pacific theater like wildfire. Within days, every pilot in the Southwest Pacific had heard about the ace who shot down an American transport to save it from capture. Within weeks, Air Force magazine featured the story. Curtis's P-51 Bad Angel soon carried evidence painted on its fuselage. 7 swastika kill marks for German victories. 1 fasces symbol for the Italian Mach C-202. 1 rising sun for the Japanese Ki-46, and 1 American flag, unique among all fighters in the Pacific. Pilots came from other squadrons just to see the aircraft, to photograph those unusual kill marks. Curtis had become the only ace to shoot down aircraft from 4 different air forces: Luftwaffe, Regia Aeronautica, Imperial Japanese Navy, and the United States Army Air Force. General Kenny's commendation was direct. The oak leaf cluster to Curtis's distinguished flying cross cited extraordinary heroism and quick thinking in preventing enemy capture of American personnel. The accompanying air medal praised him for destroying an American transport aircraft to prevent its capture by Japanese forces while ensuring the safe rescue of all personnel aboard. What made the decision remarkable wasn't just the unusual target, it was the precision required. Disabling both engines without destroying the fuselage or killing anyone required marksmanship most pilots never developed. Under stress, with Japanese guns shooting at him. Low on fuel, racing against time, Curtis had put his bullets exactly where they needed to go. Modern fighter pilots study his decision in tactical leadership courses. The scenario gets presented as a case study in judgment under pressure. You're circling over enemy territory with low fuel. You see a friendly aircraft about to land at an enemy base. Radio contact is impossible. What do? There's no clear answer in regulations. The decision requires judgment, tactical understanding, and willingness to accept responsibility for unprecedented action. Curtis had that quality. He demonstrated it when he broke formation to save a wingman over Salerno. He'd shown it again by volunteering to return to combat, and he'd proven it definitively over Bataan Island. Louis Curtis and Svetlana Valeria continued dating through the final months of the war. He'd fly combat missions during the day, then meet her at whatever field hospital she was assigned to. Their shared experience over Bataan became a story they told together. When people asked how they met, Svetlana would explain that he'd shot her down, adding that it was the most romantic first date ever. The war ended in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Curtis had survived against all odds. 2 theaters of combat, POW camps, escape, over 100 missions. On April 2nd, 1946, they were married in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The ceremony was small, attended by family and fellow pilots. The best man had flown with Curtis in the Philippines. The maid of honor had been on that C-47, floating in the raft, watching tracers light up the night sky. The wedding toast included jokes about Curtis having to shoot down his bride to get her attention. Everyone laughed, because enough time had passed that the terror had faded, leaving only the miracle of survival. Curtis stayed in the military when the Air Force separated from the Army in 1947. He flew C-54 transports during the Berlin airlift, delivering supplies to West Berlin during the Soviet blockade. He retired in 1963 as a lieutenant colonel and started a construction company in Fort Wayne. They stayed married for 49 years, through the Korean War, Vietnam War, Cold War, and all the changes that transformed America. Through raising their 2 children, Christopher and Valeria Louise. Through the lingering effects of combat trauma that Curtis never fully discussed, but sometimes woke from in the middle of the night. On February 5th, 1995, just 5 days before the 50th anniversary of shooting down the C-47, Louis Curtis died at age 75. Svetlana was with him, holding his hand, remembering a night in 1945 when a pilot had shot her out of the sky and saved her life. She lived another 18 years, passing away in October 2013 at age 87. She'd spent nearly 5 decades married to a man who'd loved her enough to shoot her down. Today, Louis Curtis's P-51D Mustang Bad Angel sits in the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. Visitors pause at the unusual kill marks painted on the fuselage. 7 swastikas, 1 fasces, 1 rising sun, and that distinctive American flag that makes people stop and ask questions. Museum docents tell the story. The American pilot who shot down an American transport. The girlfriend who was aboard. The medals awarded for technically destroying friendly aircraft. It sounds too dramatic to be true, but every detail is documented. Combat reports filed February 10th, 1945. General Kinney's commendation letters. The passenger manifest. Photographs of Curtis in his cockpit with all 4 flags visible. The aircraft itself is a testament to the P-51's role in the air war. The Mustang was arguably the best piston-engine fighter of World War II. The kill marks tell a story of the global nature of the conflict. German kills from the Mediterranean, where American forces fought to liberate North Africa and Italy. 1 Italian kill from when Italy fought alongside Germany. 1 Japanese kill from the Pacific's island-hopping campaigns. And that American flag, representing something unique in military aviation history. the only intentional, officially credited shoot-down of a friendly aircraft by an American pilot. Not a mistake, not friendly fire and chaos, but a calculated decision to destroy American property to save American lives. The broader lesson is about adaptation and judgment. War presents situations no training manual covers, scenarios regulations don't address, moments where the person on the ground has to make decisions that can't wait for higher authority. Curtis demonstrated this repeatedly, breaking formation to save a wingman, escaping from a POW camp, volunteering to return to combat, and ultimately shooting down an American aircraft because letting it land would have been worse. That's what made him exceptional. Not just flying skill or marksmanship, though both were outstanding. What made Lewis Curtis remarkable was his ability to think clearly under pressure and take decisive action when hesitation would have been easier. In the end, those 4 flags on Bad Angel's fuselage tell a story about different kinds of courage. The swastikas represented conventional courage, engaging enemy fighters, accepting the risk of being shot down, pressing attacks when easier options existed. The Italian fasces represented opportunistic courage, taking advantage of moments when they appeared, quick recognition, and faster shooting. The Japanese rising sun represented survivor's courage, coming back from being shot down, from imprisonment, from months hiding in enemy territory, volunteering to return when nobody would have blamed you for going home. But that American flag represented the hardest courage of all, the willingness to do something that looked wrong, that violated regulations, that could destroy your career. The courage to trust your own judgment over official procedure when lives depended on making the right call. Lewis Curtis faced that moment and made the hard choice. He shot down Americans to save Americans, destroyed American property to protect American lives, risked court-martial to do what he knew was right, even though he couldn't prove it until after. General Kenney recognized that courage by awarding medals instead of punishment. History recognized it by preserving Bad Angel, where future generations could see those 4 flags and learn the lesson they represent. The lesson about judgment under pressure, about the difference between rules and principles, about when to follow orders and when to trust your assessment of the situation. Sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is the thing everyone tells you not to do. Sometimes following orders means understanding the intent behind them rather than the literal words. Sometimes saving lives requires destroying property, even when that property belongs to your own military. That American flag on Bad Angel remains unique. No other American combat aircraft carries a similar mark, because no other American pilot faced the same situation or made the same decision. It's a symbol of the moment when one pilot looked at an impossible choice and found a solution that saved lives precisely because it violated every standard procedure. Lewis Curtis never claimed to be a hero. In interviews after the war, he consistently downplayed his role, insisted he was just doing his job. That humility was itself revealing. The best combat leaders rarely think of themselves as exceptional. They just recognize what needs to be done and do it. When Lewis Curtis died in 1995, he left behind a widow who owed him her life, children who'd grown up hearing how their father had shot down their mother, and a legacy that extended far beyond his combat record. He'd proven that warfare required more than courage and skill. It required judgment, adaptability, and willingness to take responsibility for decisions that couldn't wait. That's how an American fighter pilot shot down his own plane and got a medal. Not through luck or accident, but through skill, judgment, and the courage to do the right thing when the right thing looked wrong to everyone who didn't understand the full situation. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying the enemy, but from saving your own people, even if saving them means shooting them down.
The story sounds like Hollywood wrote it. An American P-51 pilot gets shot down behind enemy lines in Czechoslovakia and spends days hiding in the forest. As night falls, he watches two German mechanics fuel up a Focke-Wulf 190, then walk away, leaving it unguarded. He sneaks through the fence, spends the entire night studying German instruments, then at dawn fires up the engine and blasts between two hangars. He flies 200 miles at treetop level back to his base in France, where soldiers think he's attacking. He belly lands the stolen Focke-Wulf 190 with rifles pointed at his cockpit until his CO recognizes him and asks where the hell he's been. It's been repeated in countless articles, videos, and even influenced Top Gun: Maverick. There's just one problem. Almost none of it actually happened. The real story involves bored occupation forces after the war ended, a joyride gone wrong, and a bar story that got completely out of hand. But here's what makes this important. Bruce Carr's actual combat record was genuinely extraordinary without any of the Hollywood embellishment. Bruce Carr started flying at 15 in 1939 and enlisted in the Army Air Forces in September 1942. His military instructor was the same guy who'd taught him to fly 3 years earlier. Because of his experience, he got accelerated training and was deployed to Europe by February 1944, assigned to the 363rd Fighter Group. On March 8, 1944, Carr scored what should have been his squadron's first kill, chasing a Bf-109 to within feet of the ground. Only one bullet hit, but the German pilot bailed out too low and died. His commanders refused to give him credit and reprimanded him for being over-aggressive. The criticism created a rift that escalated to the point where Carr was placed under arrest for insubordination, with court-martial proceedings being prepared. Captain Glenn Eagleston of the 354th Fighter Group saw potential others missed and arranged Carr's transfer in May 1944. The move saved his career. On September 12th, Carr's flight spotted over 30 FW-190s below them, and he dove straight into the enemy formation, shooting down 3 before escorting a damaged wingman home. He earned the Silver Star. By October 29th, Carr had 5 confirmed kills and ace status. By early 1945, he'd become one of the 354th's most aggressive pilots. But the story everyone knows about stealing a German fighter after being shot down has nothing to do with his actual combat record. In fact, it didn't happen the way it's been told at all. The legend says that in late 1944, Carr was shot down over Czechoslovakia, evaded capture for days, then stole a Focke-Wulf 190 from an active German airfield and flew it back to Allied lines. It's dramatic. It's been repeated thousands of times, and there's zero official documentation for any of it. There's no missing aircrew report for a lost P-51. MACRs were mandatory for any aircraft lost in combat. There's no evasion report, which every pilot who returned after being shot down had to file. The 354th Fighter Group's unit history mentions nothing about Carr returning in a captured German aircraft, which would have been the most remarkable incident in their entire war. When the British captured a Focke-Wulf 190 in 1942, it generated hundreds of pages of intelligence reports. An intact Focke-Wulf 190 delivered to Allied hands in late 1944 would have been equally valuable. No such documentation exists. At the 1998 Air Force Academy Association reunion in San Antonio, Colonel Carr admitted it was a bar story that got out of hand. So what actually happened? The truth is less cinematic, but makes perfect sense once you understand the context. By the time Carr got his Focke-Wulf 190, the war in Europe had ended. The 354th was on occupation duty at Ansbach, Germany, and pilots were bored out of their minds. Major Jim Dalglish, already had his own Focke-Wulf 190 he'd collected from an abandoned Luftwaffe base. When Carr saw it, he wanted one too. Carr hitchhiked to a former Luftwaffe airfield near Linz, Austria, found a flyable Focke-Wulf 190, and took it. This wasn't a daring theft from an active enemy base. It was claiming a souvenir from abandoned facilities after the war ended. For safety, he arranged P-51 escorts to fly back with him. No treetop flying, no dodging gunners, just a formation flight back to Ansbach. The problem came when he tried to land. The Focke-Wulf 190's landing gear has a secondary hydraulic lever that Carr didn't know about. He flew around trying everything he could think of, but the gear wouldn't extend. Eventually, he had to belly land it, grinding metal across the runway. The famous footage of him with the damaged aircraft was shot at Ansbach after a joyride gone wrong, not in France after a dramatic escape. Shortly after, the USAAF banned pilots from taking German aircraft, not for security reasons, but because bored pilots were interfering with official intelligence collection efforts. But by then, the Barr story was already growing. Here's what Bruce Carr actually did that mattered. On April 2, 1945, he was leading 4 P-51s on reconnaissance near Schweinfurt, Germany, when they spotted more than 60 German fighters high above them. 60 enemy aircraft versus 4 Americans, with the enemy holding altitude advantage. Every doctrine said, avoid the engagement. Carr led his flight straight up into them anyway. In the dogfight that followed, he personally destroyed 5 enemy aircraft, 2 FW-190s and 3 Bf-109s, while damaging a 6th. His wingmen accounted for additional kills. Total, 15 German fighters destroyed by 4 P-51s. Carr's 5 kills in one mission made him the last ace in a day in the European theater. His Distinguished Service Cross citation read, completely disregarding his personal safety and the enemy's overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical advantage of altitude, he led his element in a direct attack on the hostile force. He was promoted to captain a week later and flew combat missions through the end of the war, finishing with 14 confirmed victories and 172 combat missions. After World War II, he flew F-80s with the Acrojets. During Korea, he flew 57 missions in F-86 Sabres. In Vietnam, at age 44, he flew 286 combat missions in F-100 Super Sabres, earning the Legion of Merit and 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Colonel Bruce Carr retired in 1973 after 31 years of service spanning 3 wars. He died in 1998 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. That's the real Bruce Carr, a pilot who earned his achievements through documented courage and skill across 3 decades of service. The Carr legend got new life in 2022 when Top Gun Maverick used elements of it. Stolen enemy aircraft, desperate flight to safety. Millions left theaters thinking they'd seen a dramatization of real events. YouTube videos about Carr's escape rack up hundreds of thousands of views, with comment sections full of people who don't know it's fiction. This matters because it buries Carr's genuine accomplishments. 5 kills in one day against 60 enemy aircraft represents extraordinary courage. The Distinguished Service Cross, 3 wars of service, 515 total combat missions. That's the real story. The fabricated escape overshadows actual heroism with Hollywood drama. At the 1998 reunion, when Carr himself admitted the story was a Barr story that got out of hand, he was trying to set the record straight. We should listen to him. Bruce Carr doesn't need the fictional escape to be remarkable. His actual combat record proves everything necessary about his courage and skill. The story you've probably heard makes for compelling drama, but it isn't true. And Bruce Carr's real achievements, documented, verified, genuinely extraordinary, deserve to be remembered accurately. Not as the man who stole a German fighter during a dramatic wartime escape, but as an ace who earned 14 victories through skill and courage, served his country for 3 decades across 3 wars, and represented the best qualities of American military aviation. That's the story worth remembering.